Good afternoon and welcome to the Family Office webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hani Abuali and I'll be your host today. I'm thrilled to host this webinar with Ketan Patel today. Ketan is the CEO of Greater Pacific Capital, where he's responsible for overall firm strategy, leads the firm's research and ideas team, and heads the firm's investment committee. Prior to founding Greater Pacific Capital in 2005, Mr. Patel was a managing director in the investment banking division at Goldman Sachs, where he founded the firm's strategic group. He's based in London, although he has worked in London and New York and obviously spent a lot of time in Asia, and has extensive experience. I sort of think of him more as a globalist more than anything else as I've read his research over the years. Ketan was also previously a partner at KPMG, so he knows the macro and the micro really well. Ketan has tremendous global perspectives given his broad and deep experience, and what we aim to do in the next 45 minutes is to put the coronavirus pandemic in context and try to address this really as a global test of resilience, leadership, and values. The structure of the webinar is that I'll ask Ketan a few questions first, and then we'll open up the webinar for questions from you. And as we see those questions, we'll be sharing with them. So we'll get started here. And I think really the first question I would ask Ketan is that sitting in London, I guess you're now in the second biggest epicenter of this pandemic. What's been your personal experience with this, and how are you seeing it play out in the UK today?
Hey, Hani, thank you very much. And I want to thank TFO, the Family Office, and I want to thank Abdul too, and your clients and key relationships. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be talking to you, Hani. And yes, I'm in London, and I've got to say, firstly, I hope everyone is safe, you and your families, and I'm happy to report we're safe too for now. Being in London kind of gives you some perspective. It's now probably the third after, so the US, Brazil, and then the UK are the top three in terms of the highest death count. So it's a tough, sad place to be. But thankfully, we and our people are safe, and our key relationships and loved ones are safe too for now. So, Honey, a bit of a strange circumstance in the whole world.
Indeed. And really, if you think about this and you think about your business, how do you think the world has changed as a result of the pandemic from your perspective?
So, you know that I've had a global perspective for a long time and always believed that the interrelationships between countries have been so important. And so, I look at our business, we're an international business. We invest in India, but we invest in businesses that are Indian and international. So they cross all these boundaries. We tend to do nowadays a lot more businesses that are tech, healthcare, and services businesses with some sort of global remit, some Indian-based too. So I look at that, and the pandemic has severely impacted, of course, all aspects of the global model. Trade is severely impacted, of course, but all manner of communication, the ability to build trust, face-to-face has been completely undermined. And people are in a global recession at the same time, and also figuring out how just to survive. So, I'm seeing now a change, quite a dramatic change in strategies, not just in our portfolio companies, but in also the relationships that we have around the world. Happy to drill down a lot more on that, because I think the world has actually turned upside down, and I'll talk about that as we go through it. But this is not the world we began with. And I don't think it will be the same going forward. Strategically, economically, geopolitically, the world has changed.
And Ketan, if you were just to, looking from your perspective, think about who comes out of this, who are the winners, who are the losers among the countries. So we're going to start from the top first, macro, and then we'll drill down to the companies. But from a country's perspective, how do you assess that?
So, I would think that here's a good framework to look at it. And let's take just two very simple metrics. The first is who was able to save lives of their own people. And number two, who was able to save their economies. Clearly, in any wartime scenario, and this is a little bit like that now, you have those two objectives. You don't want to undermine the lives of your people, and you don't want to lose your economy. And what we have today is that if you rank countries along those two axes, saving lives of your people and saving the economy, this is where the world is turned upside down. So the most unsuccessful layer of people who have not managed to do either well has America in the leadership of not doing well. And that's astonishing, because none of us would have thought that. Given the legacy and the history of America's ability to navigate crises, whether it was the global financial crisis, whether it was the Cold War, whether it was 2 wars before that, it's astonishing that America has the biggest lack of success in doing that. And then, so that's category 1, I guess. Category 2, above that, would be the old European powers, particularly led by the UK, but other Europeans too, plus Brazil. And so you have another category of people who did not manage to move quickly enough, smartly enough, and actually save their people or save their economies. And then the third, actually, a long way away from that, is the rest of the world. The countries that sometimes people have looked at as the poor countries, the developing countries, the Asian economies that may or may not catch up, but not the most powerful countries in the world. And so, but those countries have managed to look after their people. They have suffered varying degrees of economic loss, but their priority has been to save their people, and they've managed to do a decent job till now. And this is where the world is upside down. The pyramid is inverted. And now, it's up. It's at the bottom of the pyramid, at the sharp end at the bottom is America. And then the last great power, the UK, with a few other European colonial ex-powers. And then you have the rest of the world. And that's quite a change in the world order that we've now witnessed.
And when you, just given your experience, particularly in India investing, how does India fare, and how have they done in this environment, and how are they likely to deal with the crisis going forward? What are their bright spots? What are the challenges?
So, Hani, I would say that the epicenter of the pandemic has moved in a very systematic manner across the world, but it's gone from east to west. So, it went from China, then it hits Europe, and there's a tragedy therefore unfolding in Europe a few months ago, a month and a half, 2 months ago, and then it goes to America, and then it starts to hit Brazil as the next epicenter, and it looks like it comes back and it starts to hit other parts of Asia in a second wave. And India, of course, is in the transition of being in the first wave and the second wave almost in parallel. So if you look at it, the advanced economies of the world saw their GDPs contract 8%, so minus 8% GDP growth rate. The US was minus 8%. The Eurozone was minus 10%. Japan was minus 6%, so from the advanced economies. If you look at the emerging markets, 2 stand at a fall, but not as dramatically as people thought for 2020, at least in terms of expected fall. So the emerging markets overall are relatively neutral, perhaps a 1% fall. India falls about 4.5%, so that's relative to the developed markets of the West being about 8 to 10%. So India's at that stage. It's not fallen as dramatically, but at a higher base to begin with. And I would say it's the jury's not done. India did some very dramatic things to begin that no one thought a country that was a democracy could actually get done. We saw China do dramatic things, and we always for years thought that was because it was China and they were an autocracy and they could get things done. But this government in India closed all its borders early when they had something like less than 50 cases. So you had the borders sealed. You had strict quarantining of people coming into the country who had to come in for other reasons. So that was very carefully managed. And then the country is used to curfews, sadly because of terrorist attacks, floodings, during the monsoon period and so on. But they put a curfew in, and initially there was a panic because you have a lot of poor people who wanted to get back to their villages and small towns. And so the de-urbanization began, and this is one of the big moves. You had a massive deurbanization, where people were flooded back to their villages where it might be safer. And then the government had to do some extraordinary things. And I think it was very difficult because there was a lot of misery, of course, in this initial period of figuring out where is safe. And for a poor country, I think what they managed to do is about 7 million tests so far, nearly 7.5 million tests.
Wow, that's extraordinary. I didn't realize it was that big.
Okay. So tracking and testing, the Asians in some ways learn from each other, and they learn from the best in class. So if you speak to Indians, they will not tell you that the benchmark is any longer, the US or the UK or great European countries. And they have an affection for them, of course, but they learn from the Singaporeans, the Taiwanese, the Koreans, the Japanese, and in Europe, the Germans. And they initiated enormous testing. And so just about 7.5 million people have been tested. But it's a big population. So to really hit the numbers they need to, that probably needs to go up 10x. That's the magnitude of the challenge. Then, of course, they had to institute social distancing. And so people were appointed to every small town and village to enforce social distancing, sometimes in a very brutal or tough manner, but they imposed it. And then, of course, food distribution had to happen, and they started to galvanize the old Indian system of food distribution somewhat, but also government distribution. And they started to pay the paychecks through the social network system they have, the ID system really, and the bank accounts they have to push money out. So, for a poor country and in its development stage, they did a lot of extraordinary things. But now they've opened up, as they have to. You can't keep people locked up in a country that poor for that long. There just isn't the capital or the food there. They're seeing the rate of infection rise quite dramatically. So they've zoned, and they start to impose curfews and lockdowns zone by zone. So, zoning a country of 1.3 billion is somewhat complex, but they seem to be determined to save lives.
I mean, it's quite extraordinary especially when you mention this theme of deurbanization as well. That's a kind of a reversal of what we've had, not only in India, but also in China over the last 30 years, right? 40 years, maybe longer, perhaps in India than in China. What does that actually mean when you think about investing and we think about the future of India? And I want to ask you the same question about China, but we'll get there in a minute. But specifically on India, how does that change in terms of logistics, in terms of businesses that you're considering to invest?
So I would look at it this way, and I'm going to start a little bit top down and then get straight to some of the more important themes we're seeing. So again, taking that theme of China being the benchmark of how we see an emerging economy managed top down achieve its success. So China took 50 years during communism to not succeed. So, it took 50 years to get to $1 trillion economy. And, that's extraordinarily long time. We refer to it internally in our research papers as the long haul from poverty. So 50 years, $1 trillion. Then it takes 7 years to get to $2 trillion. So extraordinary. They start the reform process, and in 7 years, they double what took them 50 years. And then in 5 years, they hit $3 trillion. That's extraordinary, right? And of course, you and I and everybody who's listening will say, see, that's China. See, that's what you can do. When you have a grip on the economy, top-down planning, you can pull the levers and things happen. So let me contrast India. So India, after the British left, took 50 years to get to $1 trillion economy. And so, again, the long haul from poverty took 50 years. Then it started its reform process, but it was late. It started 15 years after China. So it took 7 years to get to 2 trillion. Same as China, it took 7 years. Double what took 50 years, they did it in 7. And then it took 5 years to get to 3 trillion, same as China. So what's going on? See, there we were comparing the two for years, saying the reason China can do it, India can't, is because one's an autocracy and one's a democracy. But if the mass is that close, what is happening? And here's what you find is happening. China's is a very top-down model. So they injected a huge amount of state capital. They liberalized very carefully. They invited foreigners to come in. And actually in the first 7 years, maybe even in the first 10 to 12 years, people lost money. People who invested found that the system they felt was rigged against them. It was rigged in favor of the Chinese entrepreneurs. And lots of people wrote books like Mr. China, and they complained. And China had to figure out what to do, but everyone seemed to lose out. But this massive top-down spending also led to a massive urbanization and led to the building of infrastructure and so on. So why is India, without having built the infrastructure, still on the same curve as China, getting $3 trillion? And so here's the rationale. There was a mass urbanization. There was a very young population in contrast to China. So its consumerism helped, its urbanization helped. The government introduced financial inclusion, 300 million bank accounts opened in the last 5 years. So for the first time, you have people participating in the financial system. And of course, with that comes the demand for mortgages and insurance and all the rest of it. So the reason we feel the Indian comparison to China is much worse is because one started 15 years ago, before the other one. And so we're not comparing really like with like. So as we look at India, this deglobalization is probably a relatively temporary phenomenon, but not necessarily. Both countries will learn how to work remotely. Just like we're all learning, and we're on this video conference call today, and we're not sitting in a big room like I've done many times with you and your clients. So I think that is one of the key parts of the process, that our industrial society is getting restructured with digital technology that allows us to still be productive from a remote place. So deurbanization is probably a phenomenon that hits the world. We don't have to be in cities. Our retail doesn't have to be in the middle of the city. Our offices don't have to be in the middle of the city. We don't need the office space or the retail space in that way anymore. And so when we look at India, we say, what are the big themes? They're inclusion driven. And so it's financial inclusion, 300 million bank accounts open, another 300 million to go. And the technology is there to do it now. Then we say healthcare inclusion. They started a healthcare system for critical healthcare in India about just under a year ago. And what we saw was nearly 600 million homes were covered for critical care. So Indians believe it's a human right to have healthcare, which they were not able to deliver, and they started to deliver that. So healthcare inclusion is a big one. Workplace inclusion is big. 90%, 88% actually of Indians get paid cash in the hand. That seems astonishing. But let me tell you, something like 25% to 30% of Americans also get paid cash in the hands. So you wouldn't have thought that, right? So we have a two-tier global economy, let alone in a fast-growing developing country like India. So, that's another important. Educational inclusion is a big one. And we've seen in this lockdown how our children can be educated remotely. So, we also have that opportunity now to introduce digitization into that process. And so various measures of inclusion are the next wave of what drives India. And we as a firm are looking for the smartest of those that have a global solution, because anything you develop in India should be something you should be able to sell globally, not just to the developed world as they do with technology, but to the developing world too. So that's what we look for.
Fascinating, and we'll get to the deglobalization next, because you and I talked about that right before this webinar. Yeah. But maybe I can ask you just on the companies themselves, sure. Ketan, among the companies in which you have invested, or perhaps some that you follow closely, yes, which management teams have been the most innovative, sure, in dealing with COVID-19, and what are they doing differently?
So here's what we found. Companies that were physical, totally physical, have struggled. Companies that are digital have not struggled so much. So, for example, we have a company that is an engineering services business, a technology and engineering services business. That business initially had a little bit of a shock, of course, because how do you deliver thousands and thousands of engineers when there's a lockdown? Governments then very quickly said, since they provide engineering services to governments around the world using smart technology, they said, we've got to keep the lights on. We've got to keep our utilities all working. You provide an essential service, we need you on the ground. So this company adapted very quickly to turning up on the ground in a safe manner and delivering those services. So its challenge was short-lived in terms of could it impose the controls of testing, social distancing, masking, using the right PPE equipment, sourcing all of that, and so on. It was a private sector business. They did that very well, and they're on the ground in countries in the Middle East, in Australia, in the UK, in other parts of Europe, and in India too, delivering these services. 70% of their revenues are international, and so they're quite diversified. And they of course have suffered more in countries that were not good at knowing how to open their economies. But they're diversified sufficiently to have done well. Another company I would pick as an example is a digital technology business of ours that tracks your location. Now, what an interesting thing, right? You don't have to sign up, but because of the signals that go out from your phone, they can track you. And of course, they protect your privacy. So it goes through algorithms that protect you, obeying the laws of every country and region they're in. But out comes data that shows where people congregate. So one of the early things I did was put them in touch with somebody who was ex-intelligence services in the US to say, you have a massive problem in the US. Your people are still on the streets, and you need to know where they are so you can disperse them because they're infecting each other. Or you have an infected individual that you need to track. So we have a company that can do that for you. And it can be done very smartly, pinpoint accuracy, real time. So this is a very valuable business, of course, for us and for governments around the world who need that. And for private individuals, for hospitals and so on that need this sort of information. And it turns out it's a very powerful business to have as you come out of a recession, because you want to know when and how you get people into your shops. And so if someone is passing you and you want to contact them, to encourage them to queue and come into your shop, this technology can help you do that. So, Hani, we've had some very good examples of our businesses adapting, and we've said to them very simply, and I think this applies to everybody who's in the audience too, it's a 3-point strategy. Number one, make sure you're safe. Number two, secure your biggest clients. And so a massive campaign of communication with the clients to adapt to their needs. And number three, go after your competitors' clients, because there are so many people who will not adapt. So that 3-point strategy is something we've pushed out into our businesses, and we've found they've done well. This will be a bad year, but they've done well. We're confident it can go well.
Yeah. Maybe if we switch gears a little bit, because you do reference China quite a bit and the comparisons there. What challenges do you see in China from your perspective here? And how are they different, perhaps, from other countries?
So the first challenge, sadly, is that this began in China and in Wuhan, which is a city I know well. I've been to many times in the past. We had an investment there too many years ago, and I used to travel and visit. And I got to know the government, and I got to know the bureaucracy and the administration. And so I feel enormously sad that this tragedy hit China, hit Wuhan, and they had to cope and they had to figure it out. China were ahead of the curve figuring it out, and they have one of the lowest falls in GDP in figuring it out. Unfortunately, the way China communicated to the world, the pace at and the accuracy of that undermined trust in China and undermined trust in how well China has or hasn't done. And I think this is one of China's biggest challenges. For almost a month, China ran a very aggressive campaign to tell people that they were there, they were victims, they were there to help other people, they would export equipment, and they would do everything they could to help mitigate the impact. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well either for China. And whether it's Australia, whether it's the US, with its long-standing rivalry and conflict now developing with China, whether it's the European countries, including Germany, and others that have always been very careful about what they say, there is a breakdown of trust with China. And this may be one of the most defining themes coming out of this pandemic. So China will economically probably come out better than almost any economy in the world. There's still a positive GDP. But unfortunately, there is this breakdown of trust where there will no doubt be investment opportunity and people will continue to look at it. But with a systematic breakdown of trust, I think what happens is people re-examine why their factory should be there. So the Japanese have relocated have a government fund and they want their factories relocated. The government will help the private sector relocate their factories back to Japan or to other countries in Asia. I think every company in the world is looking at the contract they have with Japan in terms of the moral contract, the social contract, the employment and economic contract, and reassessing why they're there. And look, there's lots of reasons to be there. This is a real shift, a seismic shift in geopolitics that is underway now.
And maybe just following up on that, I mean, I think it was Tim Cook that asked this question even at the very beginning of the China trade war, where he said it's really hard to build an ecosystem of the scale that they have in Shenzhen, for example, and Foxconn and all the other suppliers that exist, because there's just no concentration of, no place with such a large concentration of highly technical engineers or very specific skill set as it relates to Apple and its products and all the all that comes with that. So that kind of tells me it's, the barriers to entry there are actually not that low for high tech precision. When you're moving up the value chain, obviously it's been happening on the low value chain for many, many years now, with manufacturing for textiles, et cetera, having moved south to places like Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, et cetera. But then how do you think about the stuff that's on the upper end of the value chain?
So look, I would firstly say that not having China as part of the global community is not an option. And figuring out how to come to terms with whatever has happened in this pandemic and whatever people feel are the trade injustices that they feel they have suffered under China is something also people have to come to terms with. But China being a participant, a responsible participant in the global community, is essential for us to have a peaceful global trade scenario and a peaceful geopolitical scenario. And so this is one thing of very great importance. But I would also say this, though, that if you're America today and you see the scale of China, you have 330, 340 million people. They have 1.3 billion people, rising to 1.4 billion people. They have an industrialization model that is outstripping and outscaling yours, and you've helped them do it. And you see China's political muscle at the UN, at the WTO, and so on, growing systematically. You see the rivalry, and you see who the next runner of, or the winner of the world order might be. So I think this conflict is a little bit like the Cold War, where it won't matter who's in charge in the presidency. There will be a series of moves that will allow America to look at China as somebody they have to slow down, not necessarily fully contain, although I wouldn't rule that out, but slow down so they can figure out how to work with China. And if you are a business in China after the local market, of course you see this enormous opportunity. And this is the interesting part of capitalism. Capital will go wherever the profits are. And if the profits are in China, they will go there. And governments may make different decisions. And so this will require quite a different approach from the old Cold War. But something else to add to that, in the ecosystem you spoke about, the Chinese cost structure has been growing very dramatically. So China 10 years ago, when people set up their factories, to China today is as expensive, if not more expensive, than it is to set up in other developed countries too now. It's catching up so fast because Chinese expectations of the ordinary people in terms of what they should be paid is huge. And so the rate at which China produces engineers is vast, but people are discovering that it costs a lot. The competition for them makes them very expensive. So the comparative advantage of China is getting rapidly eroded. For example, the Indian cost structure is something like 1/7 of China's, between 1/7 and 1/10, depending on the industry of China. So it's that much cheaper. And India also produces a few 100,000 engineers a year and so on. But you'll see that people will increasingly introduce automated factories and robots and seek for ways to displace people. And so it then comes down to the cost of capital, your ability to get land permissions, the willingness of your government to help you do it. And If you take any industry in China and you plot who are the top 20, you'll find that they're almost all Chinese companies. So China's introduced a model of business in every industry where foreign businesses cannot become number one in whether it's insurance or technology services or whatever it is. You cannot become one of the top 10 to 20. So these are the things that will need to change as China restrikes its bargain with the world. China's super smart, and they will get their mind around this and they will figure this out. But in the meantime, sadly, there's a lot of conflict to come, I would guess.
I'm going to pause there for a moment and ask the audience to put in their questions. If you can punch that in, we can see that. I do have actually a number of other questions still to follow up for Ketan. But if you could put that into the system so we can get going here, because we're about a half hour into this and we'd like to wrap it up in another 15 minutes. Maybe while we wait for the first couple of questions, Ketan, you mentioned quite a few themes when we were discussing it. I was particularly interested in hearing about your inclusion theme. And to me, that still sounds like a domestic biased theme. I could be wrong. I know you're saying you could export some of that technology, but maybe start with helping us with what are the other themes that you're looking for? What industries do you think, as an investor, or sectors we should be looking at? And then we'll get to your inclusion theme also.
Sure. So we see three important themes, strategic themes for investing. One is digital, second is distribution, and the third is diversification. It's coincidentally 3Ds. We don't really work that way and look for these kind of strange three-letter acronyms to call things. But if I take
digital, distribution,
and diversification, and I'll explain what that means in an Indian context as well as a global context in a moment. So if I take digital first, that's an obvious one. Everyone looks at it and says, of course, Amazon should do well, and the Indian Amazon should do well. Whatever the equivalent is, you should find them and you should invest in them, and they should do well. But I'm going to go beyond that and say it's a very specific kind of digital that has done well in this market. And it's a very different kind of digital that will do well than yesterday's digital as we go forward. So people are able to preempt human behavior, analyze it mathematically, to figure out characteristics of individuals, and to use it to sell them things. By understanding their location, their preferences, their psyche, their pattern of behavior over a long period, and then use that to extrapolate to what they might buy in a very intimate fashion to offer them their marketing propositions. That's a very sophisticated mathematical requirement. And I think we're seeing lots of that emerge in India because it has a huge amount of data analytics engineers, mathematicians, physicists, and so on. So it produces lots of those. And so our businesses that are in data and digital hire those kind of engineers. The other place they find those kind of engineers at that level tend to be in San Francisco. And as you know, lots of those are Indians too. So, we're finding that there are pockets of, firstly, Indians in India and Indians in other parts of the world that have these data and math skills. And of course, then there's every other race, right? You find them in Russia, you find them in South Africa, you find them in many parts of the world. And so the most talented people to go after in the world are those. And that's a very big thing. The maths-related, predicting the future theme that will underlie all our digital and retail models. That's one. And there's a series of companies that come out of that. The second thing we see very much is important is distribution. Someone's got to deliver the food to your door and deliver the Amazon package. And so it isn't that the world has all gone digital. Real ability to deliver physical products safely, a very short notice, adaptively, flexibly is important. And in an Indian context, India introduced a goods and sales tax that was unified across the country. And as a result, all the barriers across states were broken down. So lorries no longer have to stop at every state boundary, pay a tax, go to the next boundary, pay a tax across the country. And that in itself is an enormous boon to how the supply chain is beginning to work. So everything to do with logistics, supply chain, distribution and the ability to trade off that has become quite an important thing. India has become the second or third biggest supply manufacturer now of PPE in the world, mainly because it has to supply itself. And supplying its own market is such a big requirement. So that's two. Number three, diversification. See, in an Indian context, and I'll take a global context too, the diversification is that there are 7 parts of India that are highly prosperous. They're between 10 million to 100 million people. Their state level GDP for 7 or 8 years has been 8 to 10% GDP growth rate. They're sophisticated, they have good rule of law, they have decent court systems, they have good governance. And so not being in just 1 or 2 of them, but being diversified across those, gives you access to about 40% of the value of India just by being in 7 places. So a very smart analytic diversification is required. The world now becomes similar. As you look at resilience, leadership, and values, you would have to have doubts about America. You'd have to have doubts about lots of Europe. But you wouldn't have doubts about Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea. There are lots of countries, Japan, Germany. So we're all going to re-rank the world, not based on the past now, but because we know who's resilient now. It's been proven. We all had the same test. If you like, someone gave us the same exam test. And the people who we thought were the stars of the classroom failed the test. So this is how much the world has changed. Sadly, this is how much, with such loss of life. And we've also found that regardless of who's in charge in Asia, whether it's a democracy or an autocracy, and this is true, I think, in the Middle East, and it's true in some other parts of the world, in Latin America and Africa, they place their people first and saving lives first. They were not ideologically driven to do anything else. And so this pandemic has revealed a lot.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We had just one question here coming through, which was being asked while you were talking about your second theme of distribution.
Yeah.
And the question relates to China having invested an enormous amount in infrastructure over many, many years, whether it's railways or highways or ports, and of course, telecom. How does that work in India, in order to, how do you address that distribution issue, and what's changed, and what do you think will change from here? I'm paraphrasing the question.
So India's physical distribution has been appalling, as we all know. India's continued to build infrastructure through this crisis, because it's one of the things that as they locked everybody else down, they could afford to get the workers to go. China's whole strategy and its build out of infrastructure and the hundreds of billions spent doing it resulted in a massive overcapacity of construction engineering skills, which it now uses in the One Belt, One Road. It also resulted in an enormous requirement for it to build infrastructure to link almost everything they possibly could. That made sense in a time when we were all looking to build these enormous factories, these enormous cities where everyone sits in the middle of the city and so on. India has to do some of that. And some of that catch-up has to happen, and India now has a national infrastructure fund headed by somebody I know very well, who is internationally trained, of Indian origin, and is building this infrastructure fund. It's attracting billions of dollars now to allow it to help build India's infrastructure now too. And so that some of that has to happen. The digital infrastructure is very interesting to contrast. So if you take China's digital infrastructure, it has a great telecom infrastructure. It's going to build 5G, probably ahead of everybody else, and distribute it. But what can you put through it? You can put some trades through it, if you're Alibaba, or an equivalent business. But you and I cannot transfer knowledge across it, information across it, criticism across it, so free-moving social media across it. So the things that define our world today in the rest of the world, I'm allowed to criticize you, Hani, you can criticize me, you can put a blog up, we can criticize the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of a country. We can exchange information freely about everything we choose to. And that's what builds our societies and builds the knowledge base and the openness. China will not do that. They will do it sometime in the future. But today they don't feel confident to do that. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges for China. But India freely moves this around. And so at every level of Indian society, what you will see, I think, is information infrastructure being built on a telecom infrastructure to a very sophisticated level, to the levels that we see in the most advanced economies in the world. And China is, for now, because it doesn't trust its people with that information, the freedom of that information, choosing to forego that. And I think that's not sustainable for China. But China will have to pay a horrible price when its people demand the right to do that. But India will never have to. And for the world moving from an industrial economy to an information economy, India is enormously well suited to do that. So, I'm very optimistic about India being able to build the right infrastructure for the post-pandemic future that is much more information-driven.
Another question that came through is, how do you see the capital markets in terms of recovery and performance over the remainder of 2020 and into 2021, if you're looking at ahead?
So let me take a very simple global perspective. I was delighted to be able to host for the United Nations and the World Academy of Art and Science last week, actually a week before last, a session looking at this exact theme of the role of finance in the future of the world. And it was fascinating. And the capital markets were one small theme of that whole conversation. It lasted about 2 hours. It's on YouTube and available if you have a chance to look at it. And I think you'll be excited to see the sorts of radical things people think will happen to money and the role of capital and the role of finance. But on the capital markets in particular, there has been such an injection of money into the capital market, particularly in the US. I was going to say on the markets, there is so much liquidity pushed into the market. It makes sense that there is a decoupling almost between, for now, the capital markets and the real economy. But I don't know whether that's sustainable. We're about to see a whole series of announcements in the second half of results from major corporations. And those won't be good. And we're actually in a real recession where none of us feel comfortable to go out and shop in supermarkets and malls and be entertained, right? So the real results will catch up at some point. Now, they could keep injecting liquidity for the next 12 months to 18 months and see if they could get us past this so that the markets stay buoyant and we get through it. At some point, I'm afraid we're all going to announce very bad results. We'll see lots of bad results announced around the world, and that will make an impact.
But don't you think public markets will have discounted that, saying, yeah, that's history, I'm looking forward, I already know that, I knew it was going to be
bad? I think they might have. But the reaction to small news is so high and so volatile. I wonder what amount of triggers does it take? And what amount of capital do you carry on printing before people start to worry that a country is overstretched? And how many countries can keep doing that? If you take reserves as a simple measure, and look, interest rates and inflation are low, people can keep pumping money, right? But American reserves are 128 billion or so of reserves. Chinese reserves are 3.1 trillion. The EU has 1.4 trillion, right? Japan has 1.4 trillion. US reserves are not that big. So the US is placing an enormous bet. And that bet is, they're putting all their chips on a roulette wheel, right? On one part of the roulette wheel, saying, I will just keep printing money heroically. I think they might actually pull it off and keep doing it. So I would withhold judgment on whether there is a crash to come, because it's an election year too. It makes a lot of sense for someone to have that strategy for America.
Well, when you have a reserve currency, they're pretty much privileged to be in that position where they can print forever. Listen, this has been fantastic, very illuminating. Thank you, Ketan, for your time and for your very thoughtful comments. I'm sorry you dropped off there for a minute, but we're wrapping up here as we're coming up to a little over 45 minutes on our call. And for the audience, just again, a quick update. July 7th, please sign on for the next webinar. Our host will be Naji Name, and our guest will be Jim O'Neill. Looking forward to the next webinar. Ketan, thank you a million for your time and for your insights.
Thank you very much.
We'll wrap it up. Thanks. Take care.